Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly chat. Thanks for joining me again on this absolutely fantastic day. I'll be honest with you, I'm inside just for this. I've been working on the laptop outside. It's just too nice a day to work inside. But thanks for joining our chat this week. Memorial Day's coming up, and it seemed the timing was kind of perfect when I saw a question that was posted on social media pages, and it made its way to me. I had answered the question, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about it because it's one of those things that I think I take for granted sometimes. Ernst Place. It's a little street down at the west end of our village, and I take for granted that people just know what it's about and how it got its name, along with a lot of other street names. But someone had asked, they were driving around the circle, and they saw the signs that said Ernst Place, and they had asked on social media if anyone could shed light on how that street got its name and why it's a street, because it is in a weird little location and it doesn't even seem like it's a street because it's on the circle. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But Ernst Place is actually named for Lawrence F. Ernst, who has the sad distinction that he was the first young person from the town of Aurora to give his life in military service overseas during World War One. He was killed in action on June 14th, 1918, um, and he was the first young man from East Aurora to die in service in the war. So the village named the street there Ernst Place in memory of him. And by extension, it's in memory of everyone who's given their lives to the service of their country. So his story is actually Lawrence Ernst, and I'll post a picture of him. His story is really symbolic. By extension, we can tell the story of those service members who served from East Aurora, especially in World War One. And I'm just going to share a few things that I've learned when I was researching, and some of the things that I never even realized, especially about World War One. We had several young men give their lives during the war, and Private Ernst was the first, like I had said. So his parents received a telegram, and his family is actually still here in East Aurora. So you'll know a couple Ernsts around town, and they are related to him. And the family still has the telegram that his mother received, sharing the news that he had passed. And actually, there was a great story on I think it was CBS the other day about a military wife. They had actually named, and I can't remember all the details. I'm sorry about that. But if you just look it up, a military wife spouse had received a telegram that her husband had died in service, and she actually got things to change where now because of her, they send a person to give a personal um, uh, uh, announcement to the family to tell the family, and so you're not getting this impersonal telegram. But that's how it was done during World War One. So the family still has the telegram. Lawrence Ernst had died at Belleau Wood, and he one of the things about his service that is very symbolic of World War One that I didn't realize is, like many of the young men and service members who died in service over there, they were buried in France. And then after the war, their remains, not all of them, but a lot of their remains were returned to the United States. But in his case, and in the case of many others, it was 3 years after their passing that they came back. So funerals were happening here in East Aurora for those who died in World War One, but in 1921, 1922. And I actually was thrown off a little bit, and this is when I learned this, is I was going through old East Aurora advertisers and doing some research, and I'd seen, I think it was actually Lawrence Ernst, or there's a couple other service members, and I came across, and they were talking about their service and how their funerals were being held. I said, this doesn't make any sense. The war ended in 1918. Why would they be funerals? Well, it's because they didn't have the ability to bring the remains back to the United States so quickly. So they buried them over in Europe, and then after the war was over, slowly everyone was brought back for burial here. So that just kind of tells you this, his story is very symbolic. By extension, the stories of all the families. Just imagine that you lost somebody, and you had to wait up to 3 years to have a funeral, and to have that final closure. So that happened a lot during World War One. And the telegram is a really important thing. Part of that story, like I said before, today we see it as impersonal, but that's how it was done. Um, and they actually, to go back to the point about the woman, the spouse who got that whole procedure changed, they were naming, I believe, a base after her and her husband, and they were telling the story on, I think it was CBS, about how her role in getting that changed, and that she in honor of that and the work she did for that, they named a base not only for her husband but for her as well. So the telegram is still with the family for Lawrence Ernst, but the village renamed the road. Well, today it's hard to see in front of McDonald's there, right? There's a street sign there, but there really isn't a road because it's part of the circle. Well, before 1936, there was a triangle there rather than a square. Actually, a set of two triangles. So the one long end of the triangle, if you will, furthest west, right in front of what is today McDonald's, it would have been the Circle Inn at the time, uh, or before that, it was known as the West End Hotel because the Circle didn't exist yet. There was a triangle there, and the long end of the triangle actually was the road they named. Well, when they reconfigured the circle, the triangles into a circle, the road kind of got lost. There really isn't a road there anymore. So that made it easy to forget, unfortunately. So back in 15 years ago now, they reconstructed Main Street in East Aurora, and part of that was reconstructing the circle. I can't remember if there was street signs there before the reconstruction, but there certainly wasn't any after. And it had bothered me for a while. I'd get questions about Ernst Place, or Lawrence Ernst would come up in my research, or in the newspapers, and I'd always talk about Ernst Place. We have a road named after him, and a lot of our roads in many towns, not just East Aurora, if they're named after somebody, it's simply because the family owned the land around it, or the street or road led to their farm. So you would go on the Underhill Road to get to the Underhill farm. But this road was very unique, and it was named in honor of somebody and their service, their ultimate sacrifice to their country, and by extension everybody. So it really bothered me that the sign hadn't been there. So all I did was back in 2018, 2019, is wrote a letter to the village, the mayor and the village board, and asked. I said, it seems a shame that we have signs for streets that have are named after trees, and our main street, which is obvious, but we don't have a sign. Something happened where this sign disappeared off of Ernst Place. And one day, a family member of the Ernst family came into my office, and they were so excited about the signs that had appeared at the West End. And the village had put the signs up, the Department of Public Works, and I didn't know about. I knew it was in the works, but I didn't know exactly when it was happened. And the family had acknowledged that had happened. And it was one of my favorite things to see as part of my job, is to acknowledge that. So somebody literally driving around, it gets the conversation started. Someone driving around the circle sees the sign, and now today we're talking about it again, and talking about the service of the folks who died not only in World War I serving their country, but in all conflicts. So I thought it would be a great idea, thanks to the person who brought it up a couple weeks ago on social media, to talk about it again, to bring it up again. One of the points was about Lawrence Ernst as well, in addition to the fact that it took 3 years for his remains to come back to East Aurora. And by the way, he's buried in the Catholic cemetery on Bowen Road. But the telegram that his mother received was she received it on August 15th. He died on June 14th. So it was 2 full months between his passing and when the family was notified. So our communication systems are much more advanced today. So it would have taken a long, long time relative to how we're used to things for the family even to find out. And then the remains coming 3 years later in in many instances. So it's hard to imagine that in a world today where we have satellite technology and email and things like that. How long it would have taken for the families to find out. In one instance, Freddie Bann, actually, there was Roy Crofter whose son died in service, and he found out just as or after the victory and the peace was declared on November 11th of 1918. So everyone was celebrating the end of the war, and then families are finding out after the fact. They're thinking the war's over and that their sons and daughters are going to come back safe, including Red Cross nurses and all those folks who were serving, thinking they're going to come back safe because the war has ended, only to find out that because of the delay in the communication, that they had already passed away before the war had ended. So again, it gives us a lens into what was happening at the time, communication-wise, and what the families were going through. So service in the military was just for the families at that point. It's tough anytime, but at that point it was just different in World War I. And I didn't even realize some of this stuff until you start reading the stories of these folks. That's the story for Memorial Day I wanted to share. I like to share this particular story each year, and thanks for folks bringing it up. I will put Lawrence Ernst. Actually, I'll put his whole biography that I wrote, including the telegram, the text of the telegram to his mother. I'll put that up in the comments. Memorial Day, which used to be known as Decoration Day, I just want to leave with this, is probably, I realized a couple years ago when I was asked to speak at the Memorial Day service here in East Aurora, and I did a little research, and the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the group of Civil War veterans, they were actually originally in charge of Memorial Day in East Aurora until about the 1930s. And then simply they became too old and too few. A lot of them had passed away by then, and there were only a couple left, and they couldn't actually physically march in the parade. So that's when the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars took over here in East Aurora. And a parade would go down Main Street, and it would actually turn. At that point, it went from Main Street to South Willow into the cemetery, to Oakwood Cemetery, for the services. Well, one year in the 1930s, two of the remaining Civil War veterans could no longer march in the parade. They couldn't physically do it. And actually, at one point, even having a car was too much for them. So one of them was actually, they were living on Hamburg Street, and they sat on the porch, and they rerouted the parade down to Hamburg Street and looped it around what is today Ernst Place, which seems really apropos. So they go past Ernst Place, the circle, past the house of the two remaining Civil War veterans, and then onto the cemetery. And the Civil War veterans, there's actually a great story about the salute. We called it the Civil War salute, where these two gentlemen stood up as the parade passed by, saluted their veteran comrades from World War I, actually, at that point. Mostly World War I. Those veterans were in the parade, and they saluted back. They weren't able to go to the cemetery. So one of the things about Memorial Day that I find interesting is it's absolutely so important. That I can't find, as I was going back to the Grand Army of the Republic, the Civil War veterans. There's a Civil War monument in Oakwood Cemetery from the 1880s, and at least from that point forward, we have had a Memorial Day service here in East Aurora and in many communities, but in East Aurora, every single year without interruption. I cannot find an interruption. So not even wars themselves or the COVID pandemic we had a couple years ago, they still managed to have a very important service in the cemetery for to remember those who gave their lives. And I don't believe there's another community event in East Aurora that has gone on that long without interruption. So 4th of July has been going on in East Aurora since the 1820s at least. We have that documented, but there's been interruptions. There's been years without a 4th of July celebration. So besides the 4th of July, I believe Memorial Day is probably the longest running community annual community event. And thanks to the folks, the veterans, they every single year they come out and in a simple ceremony. It seems simple. A simple procession takes a lot of planning and a lot of coordination, and they do it every year without fail, even during a pandemic. So if you have an opportunity, and I might sound like I'm on a soapbox here, but if there's communities that do this, either it's the town and village or fire department or the VFW or the American Legion that plan a parade and a commemoration to honor those who gave their lives in service on Memorial Day, go. If we have you have the opportunity to go and remember what it's about. And each of these little communities that do that at each of their own cemeteries, it's very important. It's just a very unique thing. From the smallest towns to the biggest cities, they're doing these commemorations and these parades um, uh, to honor those who gave their lives. So this week we remember Private Lawrence Ernst as well as all those who gave their lives. Again, I'll put his picture and biography in the comments. Um, and again, if you have any more questions, please let me know. Thanks for joining us each week. Again, you don't have to watch live. I still get questions about that. Put your comments either in the comment section or send me a private message, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us, and please remember those who gave their lives for us to be able to have conversations like this on the internet. Have a great week.